Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? I hope everything is well. Today we are journeying into an era I have thought about the most in my life, stretching from misty shores to massive stone walls, medieval England. If you find this history journey full of iron and courage interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, thinking of those grand feasts, I wondered, what is your favorite classical music instrument? Let's meet in the comments. In the fading light of a world where Rome's eagles no longer cast their shadows across Britain's shores, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The year was 410 AD, and as the last Roman legions marched away from these mist islands, they left behind not just empty fortresses and abandoned roads, but a vacuum that would reshape the very soul of a nation. What emerged from this chaos would become one of history's most fascinating transformations. A story of conquest and Christianity, of kings and peasants, of magnificent cathedrals rising from muddy fields and knights riding toward glory or doom. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let me guide you through the sweeping saga of medieval England, a tale that spans nearly 1,000 years of human ambition, divine faith, and relentless change. This is not merely the story of dates and battles, though we shall encounter both in abundance. This is the story of how a collection of warring tribes became a kingdom, how that kingdom survived the fury of Viking longships, how it was conquered by Norman knights, and how it slowly, inevitably transformed into something unprecedented in human history. The threads of this narrative stretch from the smoke-blackened halls of Saxon warriors to the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals, from the desperate prayers of monks copying manuscripts by candlelight to the thunderous charge of heavy cavalry at Hastings. We shall witness the rise and fall of dynasties, the birth of parliaments, the flowering of literature, and the endless dance between crown and church that defined medieval life. But before we can understand the majesty of what was to come, we must first witness the darkness from which it emerged. The Roman withdrawal had left Britain fractured, vulnerable, and hungry for leadership. Into this void stepped peoples whose names still echo through our language and our landscape. Warriors whose descendants would one day rule an empire upon which the sun never set. The Saxon shore, as the Romans had called the eastern coastline, lay exposed to the grey waters of the North Sea. Across those waters, beyond the horizon, where storm clouds gathered like omens, restless tribes prepared for journeys that would change everything. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisian, driven by population pressure, climatic change, and the eternal human hunger for better lands, turned their eyes toward the fertile valleys and defensible hills of post-Roman Britain. What followed was not a single invasion, but a centuries-long migration, a gradual but inexorable transformation of the British landscape. The newcomers came not as a unified army, but as individual warbands, each following their own lord, each seeking their own portion of this promised land. They brought with them their gods, their laws, their languages, and their dreams of establishing kingdoms that would endure for generations. The Romano-British population, those who had lived under imperial rule for nearly 4 centuries, found themselves facing a choice that would define the next millennium. Some fled westward to the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the flickering flame of Roman civilization and Christian faith. Others remained, gradually adapting to new masters, new customs, new ways of understanding the world around them. Still others took up arms in desperate attempts to preserve what they had known, fighting battles whose outcomes would echo through legend and song. It was during this tumultuous period that the figure we know as Arthur may have emerged, not as the shining knight of later romance, but as a war leader desperately trying to rally the Romano-British against the advancing tide of Saxon settlement. Whether he existed as a single individual or represents the collective memory of many such leaders, the Arthurian legend speaks to something profound about this moment in history, when the old world was dying and the new world was struggling to be born. The Saxon kingdoms that eventually emerged from this chaos were unlike anything Britain had known before. These were not the sophisticated administrative units of Roman rule, but personal kingdoms based on the bond between lord and warrior, between protector and protected. The king was not a distant figure residing in a marble palace, but a war leader who must prove his worth in battle, who must reward his followers with gold and land, who must embody the virtues his people held most dear. In the great halls of these early kingdoms, warriors gathered around fires that cast dancing shadows on carved pillars and painted walls. Here, the scop, the court poet, would recite tales of heroes and monsters, of brave deeds and tragic fates. The language they spoke was the ancestor of our own, rich with metaphor and alliteration, capable of expressing both the thunder of battle and the subtle emotions of the human heart. When they sang of Beowulf fighting the monster Grenell, they were not merely entertaining themselves, but defining what it meant to be a hero in their world. The religion of these early Anglo-Saxons was as complex as their society. They worshipped gods whose names still survive in our days of the week. 2. The one-handed god of war, Woden, the wanderer and wisdom seeker, Thuna, the thunder god, and Frey, the goddess of love and fertility. These deities were not distant and perfect like the classical gods of Rome, but beings who struggled against fate, who faced their own mortality, who understood that even gods must one day fall when the world ends in fire and ice. Yet, even as these pagan kingdoms established themselves across the English landscape, another force was preparing to transform them utterly. In the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, Christian monks had preserved not only the Gospels, but much of the learning of the ancient world. They had developed a distinctive form of Christianity, one that emphasized personal devotion, scholarly pursuit, and missionary zeal. Soon, these Celtic missionaries would begin their journey southward, carrying with them the revolutionary message that would reshape Anglo-Saxon England. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity was not a simple matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another. It was a complex process of negotiation, adaptation, and synthesis that would take centuries to complete. When missionaries like Columba and Aidan arrived in Northumbria, they found not ignorant barbarians, but sophisticated societies with their own traditions of law, poetry, and craftsmanship. The challenge was to present the Christian message in ways that resonated with existing cultural values, while gradually transforming those values from within. King Edwin of Northumbria, one of the first major Anglo-Saxon rulers to embrace Christianity, reportedly compared the pagan understanding of life to a sparrow flying through a warm hall on a winter's night. The bird emerges from the darkness, enjoys a brief moment of warmth and light, then disappears again into the unknown. Christianity, the king suggested, offered hope that there might be more than darkness beyond the hall, that death might not be the end of all things. This metaphor captures something essential about the Anglo-Saxon worldview and its transformation. The pagan vision was not necessarily pessimistic, but it was realistic about the transience of human achievements. The great hall would eventually burn. The gold would tarnish. The warrior would fall in battle. What mattered was to live with honor, to be remembered in song, to face inevitable fate with courage and dignity. Christianity did not entirely reject these values, but promised to transcend them, to offer eternal life to those who embraced the new faith. The process of conversion was neither uniform nor complete. Different kingdoms embraced Christianity at different times and in different ways. Some rulers like Edwin were genuinely convinced by the theological arguments. Others saw political advantages in aligning themselves with the growing Christian movement. Still others converted for personal reasons, perhaps influenced by Christian wives or advisors. The result was a patchwork of belief and practice that would take generations to standardize. One of the most significant developments in this process was the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, where representatives of the Celtic and Roman churches met to resolve differences in practice and doctrine. The questions they debated might seem trivial to modern ears, concerning matters like the proper date for Easter and the correct form of monastic tour. But these issues reflected deeper questions about authority, tradition, and the nature of Christian unity. The decision to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices had profound consequences for English Christianity. It linked the emerging English Church more closely to continental Europe, brought English monasteries into contact with the scholarly traditions of Rome, and established patterns of ecclesiastical organization that would endure for centuries. The great monasteries of Northumbria like Weymouth and Jarrow became centers of learning that rivaled any in Europe. It was in these monasteries that some of the greatest treasures of early medieval culture were created. The Lindisfarne Gospels, with their intricate interlaced patterns and glowing colors, represent the perfect fusion of Celtic artistic traditions with Christian devotion. The Venerable Bede, writing in his monastery at Jarrow, produced the ecclesiastical history of the English people, a work that not only recorded the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, but helped create a sense of English identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. The monasteries were not merely centers of prayer and contemplation, but active participants in the economic and social life of their communities. They controlled vast estates, managed complex agricultural operations, and provided essential services like education, healthcare, and hospitality. The monks copied manuscripts, taught the children of nobility, advised rulers on matters of policy, and served as diplomats in negotiations between kingdoms. As the 8th century dawned, Anglo-Saxon England had achieved a remarkable synthesis of Germanic warrior culture and Christian civilization. The great kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent had developed sophisticated governmental structures, rich artistic traditions, and extensive trade networks. English missionaries were carrying the gospel to continental Europe, while English scholars were contributing to the intellectual life of the Carolinian Renaissance. But this golden age of Anglo-Saxon civilization was about to face its greatest test. Across the North Sea, in the fjords of Norway and the islands of Denmark, another people were preparing for expansion. They too were warriors, but they followed different gods and lived by different codes. They had perfected the art of shipbuilding, creating vessels that could traverse both open oceans and shallow rivers. They had developed a culture that celebrated individual achievement, honored courage above all other virtues, and viewed raiding as a legitimate path to wealth and glory. The first sign of the coming storm appeared on June 8, 793 AD, when dragon-prowed ships materialized from the morning mist off the coast of Northumbria. The target they had chosen was not a fortress or a royal hall, but the holy island of Lindisfarne, the very heart of Northumbrian Christianity. The attack was swift, brutal, and utterly shocking to the Anglo-Saxon world. The Vikings, as they came to be known, were not mere barbarians seeking random destruction. They were calculated predators who understood exactly what they were doing. They knew that monasteries contained the greatest concentrations of portable wealth in Anglo-Saxon society, that monks were defenseless against armed attack, and that the psychological impact of desecrating holy sites would paralyze resistance and spread terror throughout the land. The attack on Lindisfarne was followed by raids on other monasteries and coastal settlements. The Vikings perfected the art of the lightning strike, appearing suddenly from the sea, overwhelming local defenses, seizing treasure and captives, and vanishing again before organized resistance could be mounted. Their shallow draft ships could penetrate far inland via rivers, bringing terror to communities that had never expected to face seaborne raiders. As the 9th century progressed, the nature of Viking activity began to change. What had started as seasonal raiding expeditions evolved into permanent occupation. The great heathen army, which landed in East Anglia in 865, was not a raiding party, but a force of conquest. Led by legendary figures like Ivar, the Boneless, and Halfdan, this army systematically conquered kingdom after kingdom, destroying the political structure that had governed Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. The response of the English kingdoms to this existential threat varied dramatically. Some rulers, like Edmund of East Anglia, chose martyrdom rather than compromise with the invaders. Others, like the nobility of Northumbria, simply fled or submitted. But in the Kingdom of Wessex, a different kind of response was taking shape under the leadership of a young king who would become known to history as Alfred the Great. Alfred's greatness lay not merely in his military achievements, though these were considerable, but in his understanding that defeating the Vikings required more than winning battles. It required transforming English society, strengthening its institutions, and creating a sense of shared identity that could unite the English people against their common enemy. The story of how he accomplished this transformation and how his successes built upon his foundation would define the next chapter in the epic tale of medieval England. But that is a story for another moment, as we continue our journey through the midst of time toward the dawn of a new age. The young king who would save England from dissolution was born into a world already transformed by Viking steel. Alfred of Wessex came to the throne in 871, inheriting not just a crown, but a kingdom bleeding from countless wounds. The great monasteries that had once been centers of learning lay in ruins, their libraries scattered to the winds, their monks fled or slain. The very foundations of Christian civilization seemed to be crumbling beneath the weight of pagan axes. Yet Alfred possessed something that his predecessors had lacked, a vision that extended beyond mere survival. He understood that the Vikings were not simply raiders to be repelled, but represented a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of English society. Their success lay not just in their military prowess, but in their ability to exploit the weaknesses of a fragmented political system. To defeat them, Alfred would need to forge something new, something that had never existed before in English history. The first test of Alfred's resolve came almost immediately in the winter of 878. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating the feast of Twelfth Night. The assault was so sudden and overwhelming that the king barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the Somerset marshes with only a handful of loyal followers. For weeks, the future of England hung in the balance as Alfred hid in the wilderness, reduced to little more than a fugitive in his own kingdom. But from this nadir, Alfred began to weave the threads of recovery, using the ancient system of beacons and messengers. He sent word throughout Wessex that the king still lived, that resistance was still possible. The response was remarkable. From villages and farms, from the halls of minor nobles and the h-vals of common soldiers, men began to gather. They came not because they were compelled by law or duty, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. The Battle of Edington in May 878 was more than a military victory. It was a moment of national awakening. Alfred's forces, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, their families, their way of life. When the Viking shield wall finally broke, it was not just an army that fled, but the myth of Viking invincibility itself. The psychological impact rippled across England like waves from a stone cast into still water. But Alfred's true genius revealed itself in the aftermath of victory. Rather than simply driving the Vikings from his kingdom, he chose a path that would reshape the entire future of England. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed with the defeated Guthrum, established a formal boundary between English and Viking territories. More importantly, it required Guthrum to accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself serving as godfather to his former enemy. This act of political theatre carried profound implications. By converting the Viking leader, Alfred was not merely ending a war, but beginning a process of cultural integration that would eventually transform both peoples. The Danelaw, as the Viking territories came to be known, would remain politically independent, but would gradually absorb English customs, laws, and religious practices. Meanwhile, the English kingdoms would benefit from Viking innovations in trade, technology, and urban development. Alfred's reforms extended far beyond military matters. He recognized that lasting victory required rebuilding the intellectual and spiritual foundations of English society. The great monasteries had been destroyed, taking with them not just religious centers, but the schools, libraries, and scriptoriums that had preserved learning through the dark centuries. Alfred embarked on an ambitious program of educational renewal, personally translating key works from Latin into English and establishing schools where young nobles could learn to read and write in their own language. The creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle stands as perhaps Alfred's greatest cultural achievement. This year-by-year record of English history, written in the vernacular rather than Latin, served multiple purposes. It preserved the memory of past events, provided a model for future chroniclers, and most importantly, created a sense of shared English identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. For the first time, people could read about their own history in their own language, connecting themselves to a narrative that stretched back to the arrival of the first Anglo-Saxon settlers. Alfred's legal reforms were equally revolutionary. The Doom Book, his great law code, drew upon the traditions of all the English kingdoms, creating a unified legal system that could govern a diverse population. But more than simply compiling existing laws, Alfred introduced new concepts of justice that reflected Christian principles of mercy and redemption. The code recognized that different crimes required different punishments, that intent mattered as much as action, and that the law should protect the weak from the strong. The transformation of military organization under Alfred created the foundation for all future English success. The old system of seasonal levies, where farmers abandoned their fields to fight for a few weeks each year, had proven hopelessly inadequate against professional Viking armies. Alfred divided his forces into two groups, one to fight while the other tended the land, ensuring that his kingdom could maintain both military readiness and economic productivity. He also began the construction of burhs, fortified towns that could serve as both refuges for the local population and bases for military operations. These burhs represented more than military installations. They were engines of social and economic transformation. Each was designed to support a permanent population of craftsmen, traders, and administrators. Streets were laid out in regular patterns. Plots were assigned for houses and workshops, and markets were established under royal protection. The burhs became centers of commerce and industry, attracting merchants from across Europe and fostering the growth of a money economy that would gradually replace the old system of barter and tribute. The success of Alfred's reforms became evident during the reigns of his successors. Edward the Elder and Athlon continued their father's work, extending the bureau system throughout the reconquered territories and welcoming Viking settlers who were willing to accept English rule. The process was not without conflict, but it was remarkably successful in creating a unified political and cultural identity. Aethelland's victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 marked the final consolidation of English power. The coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh that faced the English army represented the last serious challenge to the new order. The battle itself was remembered as one of the bloodiest in English history, with casualties so heavy that, according to the Chronicle, never yet in this island was a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword. But the victory was decisive, establishing Athlon as the first king who could truly claim to rule all of England. The 10th century witnessed the flowering of a distinctive English culture that combined Anglo-Saxon traditions with Christian learning and Viking innovations. The great monasteries were rebuilt, often on a grander scale than before. Manuscript illumination reached new heights of artistic achievement, producing works like the Benediction of St. Ethelwald that rivaled anything created in continental Europe. Architecture evolved from simple wooden structures to sophisticated stone buildings that demonstrated both technical skill and aesthetic vision. The English Church during this period developed its own distinctive character, one that balanced respect for Roman authority with local traditions and customs. English missionaries and scholars traveled throughout Europe, carrying with them not just Christian doctrine, but also the learning preserved in their monasteries. The reputation of English scholarship was so high that continental rulers regularly recruited English clerics to serve in their courts and schools. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the emergence of a truly national consciousness. The various kingdoms that had once fought each other with the same ferocity they directed against the Vikings gradually merged into a single political entity. The process was not without resistance, but it was aided by the shared experience of struggle against common enemies and the unifying influence of Christian culture. The reign of Edgar the Peaceful from 959 to 975 represented the culmination of this process. His coronation at Bath in 973 was attended by representatives from across the British Isles, including Scottish kings and Welsh princes who acknowledged his supremacy. The ceremony itself was carefully designed to emphasize the sacred nature of kingship and the divine sanction for English rule. Edgar's crown became a symbol not just of political power, but of the unity of the English people under God. The administrative system that emerged during this period was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The country was divided into shires, each governed by a sheriff who answered directly to the king. Local courts handled minor disputes and crimes, while major cases were referred to the royal court. A system of writs, written commands, issued under the royal seal, allowed the king to communicate his will throughout the kingdom with unprecedented efficiency. The economic prosperity of late Anglo-Saxon England was reflected in the growth of towns and the expansion of trade networks. London had become one of the major commercial centres of Northern Europe, its merchants trading with partners from Ireland to Russia. The silver coins minted in English workshops were accepted as currency from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean, testimony to the kingdom's economic strength and political stability. Yet beneath this apparent success, tensions were building that would ultimately lead to the kingdom's downfall. The very success of English integration had created new vulnerabilities. The unified kingdom was now a tempting target for ambitious neighbors, who saw an opportunity to seize control of its wealth and resources. The Danish kings, heirs to the Viking tradition, but now rulers of a powerful and unified state, began to cast covetous eyes across the North Sea. The crisis began during the reign of Ethel the Unready, whose unfortunate nickname reflected not personal cowardice, but the poor quality of his counsel. The renewed Viking attacks that began in the 980s were different from the earlier raids. These were not seasonal expeditions seeking quick profit, but systematic campaigns aimed at conquest and permanent occupation. The attackers were better organized, better equipped, and better led than their predecessors. The English response to this new threat revealed the weaknesses that had developed in the system Alfred had created. The burden of constant warfare had exhausted the kingdom's resources and demoralized its people. The old spirit of resistance that had driven men to fight at Edington seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a weary acceptance of defeat. When King Svein of Denmark landed with his armies, he found a kingdom that had lost the will to defend itself. The conquest of England by the Danish kings Svein and Synart marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, but not the end of English civilization. The new rulers, recognizing the value of existing institutions, largely preserved the administrative and legal systems they had inherited. Cut's reign from 1016 to 1035 demonstrated that effective kingship transcended ethnic boundaries and that the English political system was robust enough to function under foreign rule. But the Danish occupation was ultimately unstable, dependent on the personal authority of individual kings rather than institutional foundations. When Knut's sons proved unable to maintain their father's achievements, the way was open for the restoration of the ancient English royal line. Edward the Confessor's accession in 1042 seemed to promise a return to the golden age of Edgar and Athlon. But the reality proved more complex. The England that Edward inherited was profoundly different from the kingdom his predecessors had ruled. Decades of foreign occupation had introduced new influences and created new power structures. The greats who had administered the kingdom under the Danish kings had become virtually independent rulers in their own right. The Church had developed closer ties to continental Europe, bringing new ideas about reform and papal authority. Most significantly, the kingdom had become integrated into a broader European political system that extended from Norway to Normandy. As Edward's reign progressed, it became clear that the old isolation of England was ending forever. The future would belong not to those who sought to preserve the past, but to those who could adapt to the new realities of European politics. Across the Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, a new generation of leaders was emerging who would bring that future crashing down upon the English shores like a tide that could not be turned. The Norman Duke, who would reshape England forever, was born into a world where violence and ambition were the twin pillars of political advancement. William the Bastard, as he was known in his youth, had clawed his way to power through a childhood marked by assassination attempts, rebellious nobles, and the constant threat of neighboring lords who saw opportunity in his illegitimate birth. By the time he reached manhood, he had transformed the fractured Duchy of Normandy into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. The Normans themselves were a remarkable fusion of Viking energy and Frankish sophistication. Their ancestors had been Danish raiders who had settled in northwestern France barely a century and a half before William's birth. But unlike their kinsmen who had conquered England under the Normans had embraced the feudal system with extraordinary enthusiasm, creating a society where military service, land tenure, and personal loyalty were bound together in an intricate web of obligation and reward. Norman knights were unlike any warriors the world had yet seen. They fought on horseback with a devastating effectiveness that had revolutionized European warfare. Their long lances, kit-shaped shields, and heavy mail hauls made them virtually unstoppable in open battle. But more than their equipment, it was their discipline and tactical sophistication that set them apart. They could charge in perfect formation, wheel and regroup, fee in retreat to draw enemies into ambush, and coordinate infantry and cavalry in ways that earlier warriors had never imagined. The Norman Church, too, was a force to be reckoned with. The duchy's monasteries had become centers of learning and reform, attracting scholars from across Europe who brought new ideas about ecclesiastical organization and papal authority. Norman abbots and bishops were not merely spiritual leaders, but political advisors, military commanders, and cultural patrons who shaped every aspect of society. They had forged close ties with Rome, making Normandy a stronghold of church reform and papal influence. It was this combination of military prowess and ecclesiastical support that would prove decisive in the events that followed. When Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, the succession crisis that erupted would draw the Normans into English affairs with consequences that neither kingdom could have anticipated. The England that faced this crisis was a realm transformed by decades of foreign influence and internal change. The great S who had risen to power under the Danish kings had become virtually independent rulers, controlling vast territories and commanding personal armies that rivaled the king's own forces. Godwin of Wessex and his sons, particularly the formidable Harold Godwinson, had accumulated such power that they could make or break kings at will. The question of succession had haunted Edward's reign from its beginning. His marriage to Edith, daughter of Godwin, had produced no children, and his apparent preference for celibacy had led many to conclude that the royal line would die with him. Various candidates had emerged over the years, each with their own claims and supporters. Edgar the Atheling, great-nephew of Edward, possessed the strongest hereditary claim, but was still a youth with no independent power base. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, had demonstrated his military and administrative capabilities, but lacked royal blood. Most intriguingly, William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the succession during a visit to Normandy in the 1050s, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support this claim during a mysterious visit to the Norman court in 1064. The exact circumstances of Harold's visit remain one of history's great mysteries, but Norman sources insist that he pledged his support to William's claim on sacred relics, making his subsequent acceptance of the English crown not just political opportunism, but sacred perjury. The drama that unfolded in 1066 would become one of the most famous succession crises in European history, when the White, the assembly of English nobles, chose Harold Godwinson as king. They set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the most decisive battle in English history. But the challenge to Harold's reign would come not from one direction, but from three, as ambitious rulers across Europe saw opportunity in England's moment of weakness. The first threat materialized in the north, where Harold's own brother, Tostig, had allied himself with Harald Hardrada, the legendary king of Norway. Hardrada was perhaps the most feared warrior in Europe, a giant of a man who had served as captain of the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard and had fought battles from the Holy Land to the frozen wastes of Scandinavia. His claim to the English throne was tenuous at best, based on agreements made between earlier Norwegian and Danish kings. But his reputation for invincibility made him a formidable opponent. The Norwegian invasion began in September 1066, when Hardrada's fleet of 300 ships appeared in the Humber estuary. The force that landed was enormous by medieval standards. Perhaps 15,000 battle-hardened warriors who had come not just to raid but to conquer. Their initial success was devastating. At the Battle of Fulford, they crushed the forces of the Northern Ears, killing Earl Waltheof and capturing much of the Yorkshire nobility. Harold's response demonstrated the administrative and military capabilities that had made him the most powerful man in England. Within days of receiving news of the invasion, he had assembled an army and was marching north at a pace that astonished contemporaries. The speed of his movement caught the Norwegians completely off guard. When the English army appeared at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, Hardrada's forces were scattered across the countryside, many without their armor, believing themselves safe from immediate attack. The Battle of Stamford Bridge became the stuff of legend. The Norwegian king, caught unprepared, fought with the desperate courage of a man who knew his fate was sealed. According to the sagas, he fell to an arrow through the throat while rallying his men for one final charge. The slaughter was so complete that only 24 of the original 300 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The age of Viking conquest was finally over, ended by English steel, wielded with ruthless efficiency. But Harold's triumph contained the seeds of his own destruction. The forced march north and the bitter fighting at Stamford Bridge had exhausted his army at the very moment when his greatest challenge was materializing across the English Channel. While Harold was celebrating his victory in Yorkshire, Norman ships were gathering in the harbours of Normandy, and Norman knights were sharpening their swords for the invasion that would change everything. William's preparations for the conquest of England had been meticulous and ruthless. He had spent months gathering allies, securing papal approval for his claim, and assembling the largest invasion force Northern Europe had seen since the days of the Roman Empire. His army was not merely Norman, but included knights and infantry from across northern France, all united by the promise of English lands and English gold. The papal banner that flew above William's ships was perhaps his most valuable asset. Pope Alexander II had declared Harold a usurper and a perjurer, making the Norman invasion not just a political conquest, but a holy war. This ecclesiastical support had enabled William to recruit allies who might otherwise have remained neutral, and it provided moral justification for what was essentially an act of aggressive war. The Norman fleet that set sail from San Valery-sous-Sem on September 27th was a marvel of medieval logistics. Nearly 700 ships carried not just warriors, but the horses, weapons, and supplies needed for a sustained campaign. The crossing itself was a triumph of navigation and seamanship, bringing the entire force safely to the Sussex coast near Peveny, where they established a fortified beachhead. William's choice of landing site was strategically brilliant. The south coast of England was Harold's own, the heartland of his power and the source of his wealth. By landing there, William was not just invading England, but personally challenging Harold on his own territory. The psychological impact was enormous, forcing Harold to abandon his victory celebrations in the north and race south to defend his patrimony. The 2 weeks that followed the Norman landing were a deadly game of strategy and maneuver. Harold, despite the exhaustion of his northern campaign, moved with characteristic speed, gathering forces as he marched south. His plan was to repeat the tactics that had succeeded so brilliantly at Stamford Bridge: surprise the enemy with rapid movement, force them to fight on unfavorable terms, and crush them before they could consolidate their position. But William was not Harold Hardrada. The Norman Duke had spent his entire life fighting for survival against enemies who outnumbered and surrounded him. He understood that his position in England was precarious, that his only hope lay in forcing Harold to fight a decisive battle before English reinforcements could arrive. The psychological pressure on both leaders was enormous, each knowing that the fate of kingdoms hung on their decisions. The armies that finally faced each other on October 14th, 1066, at Sutlej Hill near Hastings represented two fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Harold's forces were traditional English infantry armed with battle axes, swords, and spears, fighting on foot in the ancient shield wall formation that had served their ancestors well for centuries. They held the high ground, their shields locked together in an impenetrable wall of steel and wood, their battle cries echoing across the valley as they prepared to meet the Norman charge. William's army was the cutting edge of European military innovation. His heavy cavalry, trained to fight as a coordinated unit, possessed a mobility and striking power that infantry formations could rarely match. His archers, drawn from across northern France, could rain death from distances that English weapons could not reach. Most importantly, his army was trained to fight as a combined force with cavalry, infantry, and archers working together in ways that multiplied their individual effectiveness. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare, a clash of civilizations that would be remembered and studied for centuries to come. The Norman cavalry charged again and again against the English shield wall, seeking to break through by sheer force and determination. The English held their ground with stubborn courage, their axes cutting down horses and riders with devastating effect. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The turning point came late in the day, when a rumor spread through the Norman ranks that William had been killed. The panic that followed nearly broke the Norman army, but William's appearance, helmet raised to show his face, rallied his men for one final effort. The feinted retreat that followed was a masterpiece of tactical deception, drawing sections of the English line forward where they could be surrounded and destroyed by Norman cavalry. Harold's death, struck down by Norman arrows and swords while defending his banner, marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England. The king, who had seemed invincible just 3 weeks earlier, lay dead on the field where he had chosen to make his stand. Around him fell the flower of English nobility, men whose families had ruled England for generations, their blood soaking into the Sussex soil that would become the foundation of a new order. The psychological impact of Hastings was as important as its military consequences. The English had not merely lost a battle, but witnessed the destruction of their entire political system. The ears, who had dominated English politics for decades, were dead or in flight. The church hierarchy, which had provided stability and continuity through previous crises, found itself facing new masters with very different ideas about ecclesiastical authority. Most importantly, the ordinary people of England discovered that their world had changed forever in a single afternoon of bloodshed. William's march to London after Hastings was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Rather than advancing directly on the capital, he swept through the southern counties, systematically destroying everything in his path. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with utter devastation. Town after town submitted without a fight, their leaders recognizing that the old order was dead and that survival required accommodation with the new realities of Norman rule. The coronation of William as King of England on Christmas Day 1066 was both a triumph and a beginning. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey, conducted by English bishops in the presence of Norman nobles, symbolized the fusion of two traditions that would define the new kingdom. But even as the crown was placed upon William's head, the sounds of rioting could be heard in the streets outside, a reminder that conquest was only the first step in the long process of creating a unified realm. The England that William had won was not the unified kingdom that Alfred's successors had created, but a collection of regions held together by personal loyalty and military force. The greats who had submitted after Hastings retained control of their territories, waiting for any sign of weakness that might allow them to reassert their independence. The common people, while not actively rebellious, viewed their new masters with suspicion and fear. Most dangerously, the English Church, despite its formal submission, maintained its own traditions and loyalties that would prove difficult to reshape. The years that followed the conquest would test whether Norman military prowess could create the institutions necessary for lasting rule. The challenge was not merely to govern England, but to transform it, to create a new synthesis of Norman and English traditions that could survive the death of individual kings and the inevitable succession crisis that had plagued both kingdoms. The story of how this transformation was achieved and at what cost would define the next chapter in the epic tale of medieval England. William's triumph at Hastings had given him a crown, but it had not given him a kingdom. The England he now claimed to rule was a patchwork of resentful nobles, sullen peasants, and ambitious churchmen, all united only in their suspicion of their foreign overlords. The Norman duke, who had gambled everything on a single battle, now faced the far more complex challenge of transforming military conquest into legitimate rule. The first great test came within months of the coronation. In the spring of 1067, while William was absent in Normandy, celebrating his victory and securing his continental domains, rebellion erupted across England like wildfire in a dry forest. The who had submitted after Hastings revealed their true intentions, raising their banners and calling upon the English people to cast off the Norman yoke. In the north, Edgar the Atheling, the last male heir of the ancient royal line, emerged from exile to claim the throne that many still considered rightfully his. The revolts were not mere expressions of wounded pride, but carefully coordinated attempts to exploit what appeared to be fatal weaknesses in Norman rule. The rebels understood that William's power depended entirely on his ability to maintain control of a relatively small force of foreign knights scattered across a hostile landscape. If they could isolate these garrisons, overwhelm them piecemeal, and prevent Norman reinforcements from crossing the Channel, they might succeed in driving the invaders back to their ships. William's response to this crisis revealed the qualities that had made him master of Normandy despite his bastard birth. He returned to England with characteristic speed, bringing fresh troops and a determination that bordered on the fanatical. But this time his approach was different. The magnanimous victor of Hastings had been replaced by a ruler who understood that mercy could be interpreted as weakness and that lasting peace might require temporary terror. The campaign that followed was unlike anything England had experienced since the Danish invasions. William's forces moved through the rebellious regions with systematic brutality, not merely defeating armies, but destroying the very foundations of resistance. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. The Norman knights, trained from childhood in the arts of war, proved equally skilled in the grim business of pacification. They left behind a landscape so devastated that chroniclers would write of regions where no smoke rose from any hearth for decades to come. The climax of this campaign came in the winter of 1069, when the last great rebellion erupted in Yorkshire. The northern ears, supported by a Danish fleet that appeared in the Humber, seemed poised to recreate the triumphs of their Viking ancestors. For a brief moment, it appeared that the Norman conquest might unravel completely, that William might suffer the same fate that had befallen earlier invaders who had underestimated English resilience. But William's response exceeded even his previous displays of ruthless efficiency. The harrying of the North, as it came to be known, was a campaign of deliberate devastation that transformed the Yorkshire landscape into a wasteland. For months, Norman forces systematically destroyed everything that could support human life. Mills were demolished, bridges broken, salt scattered on fields to prevent future cultivation. The population fled southward in desperate columns, carrying what possessions they could save, leaving behind a silence that would endure for generations. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond Yorkshire. Word of the devastation spread throughout England, carried by refugees whose hollow eyes and gaunt faces testified to the price of resistance. The message was unmistakable. William was not merely another foreign conqueror who could be waited out or gradually absorbed, but a ruler who would rather rule over a desert than tolerate defiance. The great rebellions that had threatened to overturn the Norman conquest died not in battle, but in the cold calculation of nobles, who recognized that further resistance would bring only annihilation. Yet even as he demonstrated his capacity for ruthless suppression, William was simultaneously laying the foundations for a new kind of government that would transform England more profoundly than any previous invasion. The feudal system that he imposed was not merely a method of military organization, but a complete reimagining of how power, land, and loyalty should be distributed throughout the kingdom. Every acre of English soil was now held directly or indirectly from the king, creating a pyramid of obligation that extended from the humblest peasant to the greatest earl. The Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey of English wealth and resources, commissioned by William in 1085, reveals the scope of this transformation. For the first time in history, a medieval kingdom was subjected to a systematic accounting that recorded not just the ownership of land, but its value, its population, its productive capacity, and its obligations to the crown. The surveyors who traveled from manor to manor asking their relentless questions about livestock and ploughland, about mills and fish ponds, about the number of villages and the extent of forests, were creating more than a tax assessment. They were mapping the scenes of a new kind of state. The Norman aristocracy that emerged from this process was unlike any ruling class England had known. These were not the traditional war leaders who had governed Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, bound to their followers by personal loyalty and the distribution of treasure. The Norman baronses were landlords, in the most literal sense, deriving their power from the systematic exploitation of agricultural resources and owing their positions to royal grant rather than ancestral right. Their castles, rising like stone mountains from the English landscape, were not merely fortresses but centers of administration, symbols of a new order that combined military dominance with bureaucratic efficiency. The castle building that transformed the English landscape during the decades following Hastings represented more than military necessity. These structures, from the simple motte and bailey fortifications that could be erected in weeks to the massive stone keeps that required years to complete, were physical manifestations of Norman political theory. They dominated the surrounding countryside, not just militarily, but psychologically. Constant reminders that power had passed into foreign hands and that the old ways of resistance were futile. The White Tower of London, begun by William himself in the years following his coronation, epitomized this new architectural language of power. Rising nearly 100 feet above the Thames, its massive walls constructed from imported Count stone. It was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. The tower was not merely a fortress, but a royal palace, a treasury, an arsenal, and a prison, all combined into a single structure that proclaimed the permanence of Norman rule more effectively than any number of proclamations or oaths of allegiance. The church, too, was transformed by the Norman conquest in ways that extended far beyond changes in personnel. The new Archbishop of Canterbury, Lamrank of Bec, was a scholar and administrator whose vision of ecclesiastical reform would reshape English Christianity for centuries. Under his guidance, the English Church was brought into closer alignment with continental practices, its monasteries reformed according to the latest European models. Its cathedral schools expanded to educate a new generation of clergy trained in both theology and administration. The architectural revolution that accompanied these ecclesiastical changes was no less dramatic than the military transformation of the landscape. The small wooden churches that had served Anglo-Saxon communities were replaced by massive stone cathedrals that rivaled any in Europe. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, pioneered architectural techniques that would influence building throughout the medieval world. Its ribbed vaults and pointed arches, its soaring columns and intricate stone carving created interior spaces that seemed to lift the soul toward heaven, while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of their Norman patrons. But perhaps the most profound change brought by the Norman conquest was linguistic. The French-speaking aristocracy that now governed England created a trilingual society where Latin remained the language of learning and administration. English survived as the tongue of the common people, and Norman French became the language of power and culture. This linguistic complexity would endure for centuries, gradually producing the hybrid language that would become modern English enriched by French vocabulary but retaining its Germanic grammatical structure. The literature that emerged from this, multilingual environment reflected the cultural fusion that was slowly transforming English society. The Chant d'Est, those heroic poems celebrating the deeds of Charlemagne and his knights, found new audiences in English halls, where Norman nobles sought entertainment that reflected their own martial values. Meanwhile, English literary traditions survived and evolved as seen in works like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which continued to be maintained by English monks, who recorded the deeds of their foreign rulers with grudging respect and occasional defiance. The legal system that William imposed represented perhaps the most systematic transformation of English institutions. The old Anglo-Saxon system of local courts and customary law was gradually replaced by a more centralized system based on royal authority and written procedure. The king's justices traveling throughout the realm to hear cases and enforce. Royal law created a common legal tradition that transcended local customs and regional variations. This development would eventually produce the common law system that would become one of England's most important contributions to world civilization. The economic changes that followed the conquest were equally profound. The Norman emphasis on systematic exploitation of agricultural resources led to innovations in farming techniques, the establishment of new markets, and the expansion of international trade. English wool, already prized in continental markets, became the foundation of a commercial revolution that would eventually make England one of Europe's wealthiest kingdoms. The Jews who arrived in England in the wake of the conquest, invited by William to provide financial services that Christian doctrine forbade to believers, established the credit networks that would finance this economic expansion. Yet beneath the impressive facade of Norman efficiency and organization, tensions remained that would shape English development for centuries. The cultural divide between Norman rulers and English subjects never entirely disappeared, creating a society marked by linguistic, legal, and social stratification. The peasantry, bearing the heaviest burden of the new feudal obligations, preserved memories of better times that would eventually fuel demands for political and economic reform. The reign of William's sons revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the system he had created. When the conqueror died in 1087, the succession dispute that erupted between his sons Robert, William Rufus, and Henry demonstrated that even the most sophisticated administrative system could not entirely eliminate the personal nature of medieval kingship. The civil war that followed, though brief, reminded everyone that Norman rule depended ultimately on the same foundations as Anglo-Saxon kingship. The ability to command loyalty through a combination of fear, respect, and material reward. William Rufus, who secured the English throne through a combination of speed and ruthlessness, proved to be a ruler whose personal vices threatened to undermine the institutional achievements of his father. His notorious greed, his contempt for the church, and his apparent lack of interest in producing an heir created anxieties that extended far beyond the immediate circle of courtiers and nobles. The king who treated the English church as a source of revenue rather than spiritual guidance, who sold bishoprics to the highest bidder and left sees vacant to collect their revenues, seemed to embody everything that critics of Norman rule found most objectionable. The assassination of William Rufus in 1100, whether by accident or design, brought to the throne his younger brother Henry, a prince who had spent his youth learning the arts of governance rather than war. Henry's reign would demonstrate that the Norman system could evolve and adapt, that the fusion of Norman efficiency with English traditions could produce a form of government more sophisticated than either culture had achieved alone. But that story belongs to the next chapter of our tale as we continue our journey through the mists of medieval time. The young prince who would become Henry II had spent his youth in the shadow of his more martial brothers, learning the subtle arts of administration and diplomacy that would serve him well when fortune finally placed the crown within his grasp. Unlike his predecessors, who had ruled through a combination of personal charisma and military force, Henry understood that lasting power required institutional foundations that could survive the death of individual kings and the inevitable succession crisis that had plagued both Norman and English dynasties. The Charter of Liberties that Henry issued upon his accession was more than a political gesture designed to secure noble support during the uncertain early days of his reign. It was a constitutional document that established principles of government that would echo through English history for centuries. By promising to respect the laws of Edward the Confessor, to limit the arbitrary exactions that had made his brother's reign so unpopular, and to govern according to established custom rather than personal whim, Henry was creating a contractual relationship between crown and subjects that represented a fundamental evolution in medieval political thought. The administrative revolution that Henry launched during his 35-year reign transformed the Norman system from a collection of personal relationships into something approaching a modern state. The Exchequer, that great accounting office that took its name from the checkered cloth on which financial calculations were performed, became the nerve center of royal government. Here, sheriffs and other royal officials were called to account for their stewardship of royal resources, their receipts and expenditures recorded on parchment rolls that would provide a continuous record of governmental activity for centuries to come. The justices who traveled throughout the realm in Henry's name were not merely settling disputes, but creating a coherent legal system that would eventually supersede the patchwork of local customs and traditions that had governed English society since time immemorial. The decisions they rendered, the procedures they established, the precedents they set gradually accumulated into a body of law that derived its authority not from ancient custom but from royal command. This common law, as it came to be known, would become one of the most distinctive features of English civilization. Henry's marriage to Matilda of Scotland, a princess who could trace her lineage back to the Anglo-Saxon kings, was a masterstroke of political symbolism that helped bridge the cultural divide between Norman rulers and English subjects. The wedding ceremony, conducted with unprecedented splendor at Westminster Abbey, proclaimed to all observers that the Norman dynasty was not merely a foreign occupation, but a legitimate continuation of English royal tradition. The children born of this union would embody the synthesis of Norman and English bloodlines that Henry hoped would unite his fractured kingdom. The economic prosperity that characterized Henry's reign was built upon the foundation of agricultural innovation and commercial expansion that the Norman conquest had made possible. The systematic exploitation of English resources, guided by Norman administrative expertise and financed by Jewish capital, produced wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything achieved by previous English rulers. The silver mines of Cumberland, the wool markets of the Cotswolds, the grain fields of East Anglia all contributed to a royal treasury that made Henry one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. But this prosperity came at a cost that would eventually destabilize the very system that had created it. The heavy taxation required to fund Henry's ambitious governmental projects, the legal innovations that undermined traditional rights and privileges, the cultural changes that threatened established ways of life, all generated resentments that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The Norman system, for all its efficiency and sophistication, remained an alien imposition upon a society that had never fully accepted foreign rule. The tragedy that would ultimately destroy Henry's carefully constructed system began with a catastrophe that no amount of administrative skill could have prevented. On November 25, 1120, the white ship carrying the flower of Anglo-Norman nobility back to England from Normandy struck a rock in the English Channel and sank with the loss of all aboard. Among the victims was William Etheling, Henry's only legitimate son and the heir upon whom the entire future of the dynasty depended. The king's grief at the loss of his son was matched only by his recognition of the political catastrophe that the disaster represented. Without a male heir, the elaborate system of government that Henry had created would face the same succession crisis that had plagued his predecessors. The solution he chose, designating his daughter Matilda as his heir, was unprecedented in English history and would prove to be a decision that would plunge the kingdom into civil war. The Empress Matilda, as she came to be known after her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and determination who had been trained from childhood in the arts of government. Her experience governing Italy during her husband's absences had given her administrative skills that rivaled those of any contemporary ruler. But her very competence, combined with her gender, made her a threatening figure to the Norman barons, who had grown accustomed to male rule and who feared that a female monarch might undermine their own authority. The oath of allegiance that Henry extracted from his nobles, requiring them to accept Matilda as their future queen, was given reluctantly and with mental reservations that would become apparent the moment the old king died. The baronses who swore to support her succession were already calculating how they might benefit from the instability that would inevitably follow Henry's death. The most ambitious among them, Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and one of his most trusted advisers, was already laying the groundwork for his own claim to the throne. When Henry died in 1135, allegedly from eating a surfeit of lamprey, the carefully constructed system of government that he had spent decades building began to unravel with shocking speed. Stephen's seizure of the throne, accomplished through a combination of rapid movement and strategic bribery, demonstrated that the institutional foundations of Norman rule were still dependent on the personal authority of individual kings. The baronses, who had sworn to support Matilda's succession, found convenient excuses to transfer their allegiance to a male claimant who promised to respect their traditional privileges. The civil war that followed, known to contemporaries as the Anarchy, represented more than a simple succession dispute. It was a fundamental crisis of the Norman system that revealed the contradictions inherent in a government that combined feudal personal relationships with bureaucratic administrative procedures. The baronses who had been transformed into efficient administrators during Henry's reign rediscovered their warrior roots, building private castles, raising personal armies, and carving out independent domains from the wreckage of royal authority. The landscape of England during the anarchy was transformed by violence on a scale not seen since the Norman conquest itself. Contemporary chroniclers described a realm where God and his saints slept, where justice had fled, where the strong oppressed the weak without restraint. The magnificent castles that had once symbolized Norman order became centers of private warfare, their lords preying upon the surrounding countryside with impunity. The roads that had carried royal justices throughout the realm became unsafe for travel, while the markets that had fostered commercial expansion were abandoned as merchants fled to safer lands. Yet, even in the depths of this crisis, the institutional innovations of the Norman period demonstrated their resilience. The exchequer continued to function, albeit with reduced efficiency, recording the diminished revenues of a kingdom at war with itself. The common law survived in those regions where royal authority could still be enforced, its procedures and precedents preserved by professional lawyers who understood that their expertise would be valuable regardless of who ultimately wore the crown. The Church, despite the violence that surrounded it, maintained its role as a stabilizing force. Its bishops and abbots working tirelessly to mediate between the warring factions. The resolution of the anarchy came not through military victory but through the kind of negotiated settlement that had become characteristic of Norman political culture. The Treaty of Wallingford, signed in 1153, represented a triumph of pragmatic compromise over ideological purity. Stephen would remain king for life, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit the throne, uniting the competing claims and ending the civil war that had devastated the kingdom for nearly 2 decades. The young prince, who would become Henry II, brought to the throne a combination of qualities that seemed designed to restore the glories of his grandfather's reign, while avoiding the pitfalls that had led to the anarchy. His Angers inheritance had given him control of territories that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had added the wealth and cultural sophistication of southern France to his domains. Most importantly, his education in the Norman tradition of efficient government had prepared him to rebuild the administrative system that civil war had damaged but not destroyed. The restoration that Henry III accomplished during the first decade of his reign was remarkable in its scope and thoroughness. The illegal castles that had sprouted during the anarchy were demolished. Their stones used to build churches and bridges that would serve the common good. The royal forests were restocked and their boundaries restored, providing both revenue and recreation for the crown. The coinage was reformed, eliminating the debased silver that had circulated during the Civil War and establishing monetary standards that would remain stable for centuries. But Henry's greatest achievement was the expansion and systematization of royal justice that would transform England from a collection of feudal territories into a unified legal entity. The constitutions of Clarendon, issued in 1164, established procedures for the administration of justice that would endure long after the Norman dynasty had passed into history. The system of royal courts staffed by professional judges and guided by written law created a judicial framework that could function independently of the personal authority of individual kings. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket, his former chancellor, who had become Archbishop of Canterbury, represented more than a personal quarrel between old friends. It was a fundamental clash between secular and ecclesiastical authority that would shape the relationship between church and state for centuries. Becket's transformation from worldly administrator to saintly martyr demonstrated the continuing power of religious idealism in an age increasingly dominated by bureaucratic efficiency. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, shocked the medieval world and transformed the ambitious archbishop into one of the most powerful saints in Christendom. The pilgrimage route to his shrine became one of the most popular in Europe, bringing wealth and prestige to England while serving as a constant reminder of the limits of royal power. Henry's public penance at Becket's tomb, where he submitted to scourging by the cathedral monks, demonstrated that even the most powerful medieval king was subject to spiritual authority. The legal innovations of Henry's reign created the foundation for constitutional development that would eventually limit royal power in ways that the king himself could never have imagined. The writs and procedures that his justices developed to handle the increasing volume of legal business established precedents that would gradually accumulate into a body of law independent of royal will. The juries that were impaneled to determine facts in civil cases represented a revolutionary recognition that ordinary people could participate in the administration of justice. The Angevin Empire that Henry created through conquest, marriage and inheritance represented the high point of medieval English power and influence. From his court at Cheyenne-Auray, the king could command resources that dwarfed those of any contemporary ruler. The wine of Gascony, the wall of England, the grain of Normandy, all contributed to a treasury that funded military campaigns, diplomatic initiatives, and architectural projects on an unprecedented scale. The troubadour culture of Aquitaine, the scholarly traditions of the Norman monasteries, the administrative expertise of the English government, all combined to create a cosmopolitan civilization that attracted scholars, artists, and adventurers from across Europe. Yet, the very extent of Henry's dominions contained the seeds of their own destruction. The king, who ruled territories that stretched from the Tweed to the Pyrenees, found it increasingly difficult to maintain personal control over such vast distances. The sons who were intended to inherit portions of this empire grew impatient with their father's longevity and began to plot against him with the encouragement of his enemies. The queen who had brought Aquitaine to the marriage became estranged from her husband and actively supported their rebellious children. The Great Revolt of 1173-1174, when Henry's sons allied with the King of France and the King of Scotland in an attempt to partition the Angevin Empire, demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the system Henry had created. The administrative machinery he had built proved capable of functioning even when the king himself was fighting for his life in multiple theatres simultaneously. The loyalty of the English baronage, secured through a combination of legal reform and material reward, held firm against the most serious challenge to royal authority since the Norman conquest. The victory that Henry achieved over his rebellious sons and their allies was complete but Pyrrhic. The king, who had begun his reign as the most powerful ruler in Europe, found himself increasingly isolated suspicious of his own family, dependent on mercenary soldiers whose loyalty could be bought but never truly trusted. The legal system that he had created to strengthen royal authority was gradually developing its own momentum, creating precedents and procedures that would eventually constrain royal power in ways that no medieval king could have foreseen. As Henry II aged and his empire began to show signs of strain, the stage was being set for the next great crisis in English history. The crusading movement that had captured the defied imagination of European nobility was creating new opportunities for military glory and spiritual redemption. The intellectual renaissance that was transforming European learning was producing new ideas about government, law, and the relationship between rulers and subjects. Most importantly, the political structures that Henry had created were about to be tested by successors whose very different personalities and priorities would reveal whether the achievement could survive the transition from one generation to the next. The story of that transition and of the dramatic events that would follow represents the next chapter in our journey through the mists of medieval time as we continue to trace the evolution of English civilization from its Norman foundations toward the constitutional developments that would eventually transform the relationship between crown and subject forever. The death of Henry II in 1189 marked the end of an era. Though few contemporaries could have understood the magnitude of what was passing, the great king who had transformed England from a war-torn realm into the administrative centre of a vast empire died at Shannon Castle, abandoned by his sons and tormented by the knowledge that his life's work might not survive him. His final words, purportedly cursing the day he was born, spoke to a deeper tragedy than personal failure. They revealed the impossible burden of medieval kingship, where the fate of nations depended on the character and competence of individual men. The son who inherited this troubled legacy was everything his father had not been. Where Henry II had been cautious, calculating, and methodical, Richard was impulsive, romantic, and driven by dreams of glory that belonged more to the pages of cavalry romance than the harsh realities of medieval politics. The new king spoke French as his native tongue, had spent most of his life in Aquitaine, and viewed England not as a homeland to be cherished, but as a treasury to be emptied in pursuit of greater adventures. Richard's obsession with the Holy Land and his determination to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin's armies reflected a fundamental shift in the priorities of European nobility. The crusading movement that had begun nearly a century earlier with Urban II's call to arms at Clermont had evolved from a spontaneous outpouring of religious fervor into a sophisticated international enterprise that combined spiritual motivation with practical politics. The Third Crusade, which Richard would lead alongside Philip Augustus of France and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, represented the culmination of this development. The preparations for this great expedition consumed the first 2 years of Richard's reign and demonstrated both the wealth that Henry II's administrative reforms had generated and the fragility of the system that had produced it. The Saladin tithe, that revolutionary tax levied on all movable property to fund the crusade, showed how thoroughly the Norman administrative machine could extract resources from English society. But the resentment that this taxation generated, the strain it placed on the economy, and the opportunities it created for corruption and abuse revealed the limits of what even the most efficient medieval government could achieve. The regency arrangements that Richard established before his departure for the Holy Land reflected his fundamental misunderstanding of the political forces that his father had spent decades learning to control by dividing authority between his Chancellor William Longchamp and his half-brother Geoffrey. Richard created a system that invited conflict rather than ensuring stability. The civil war that erupted in his absence, though brief, demonstrated that the personal authority of the king remained the essential foundation of medieval government, regardless of how sophisticated the administrative apparatus might become. The news that filtered back to England from the Crusade revealed Richard's military genius while simultaneously exposing the futility of his grand design. The Siege of Acre, where Christian and Muslim armies faced each other in a deadly embrace that lasted for months, showed medieval warfare at its most brutal and sophisticated. The tactics that Richard employed, the siege engines he deployed, the diplomatic negotiations he conducted with Saladin himself, all demonstrated that the art of war had evolved far beyond the crude bludgeoning that had characterized earlier conflicts. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, Richard's crusade achieved nothing that would endure beyond his own lifetime. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusade estates remained vulnerable to reconquest, and the enormous cost of the expedition had drained the treasuries of Western Europe, without producing any lasting strategic advantage. The king who had dreamed of emulating the heroes of Catholic romance found himself trapped in a conflict where courage and honor counted for less than logistics and finance. The capture of Richard by Leopold of Austria during his return journey transformed the absent king into a symbol of suffering that resonated throughout his domains. The enormous ransom demanded for his release, equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the English crown, required financial innovations that would have profound consequences for the development of English government. The taxation necessary to raise this sum could not be accomplished through traditional feudal obligations, but required the consent and cooperation of social groups that had never before been systematically consulted about royal policy. The negotiations that preceded the collection of Richard's ransom marked the beginning of a new relationship between crown and subject that would eventually evolve into parliamentary government. The assemblies that were summoned to approve the extraordinary taxation, the representatives who were called to London to speak for their communities, the arguments that were made about the limits of royal authority and the rights of subjects, all established precedents that would be remembered when future kings sought to extract resources from their reluctant people. The England that Richard found upon his return in 1194 was subtly but significantly different from the kingdom he had left 5 years earlier. The administrative system had proven capable of functioning without royal supervision, but it had also demonstrated its capacity for abuse and corruption. The baronses who had governed in his absence had learned to exercise power independently, while the common people had discovered that their consent was sometimes necessary for royal policy to succeed. Most importantly, the financial exhaustion caused by the crusade and the ransom had created a crisis of royal authority that would plague Richard's successors for generations. The final years of Richard's reign were consumed by warfare against Philip Augustus of France, a conflict that revealed how completely the priorities of European politics had changed since the early days of the Norman conquest, where William the Fret had invaded England to claim a throne he believed was rightfully his. Richard and Philip fought over territories and titles with a cynicism that would have shocked their predecessors. The art of war had become an end in itself, divorced from the religious and feudal obligations that had once given meaning to medieval conflict. The death of Richard at the siege of Challis in 1199, struck down by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle for reasons that remain unclear, seemed to epitomize the futility of his entire reign. The king, who had been hailed as the greatest warrior of his age, died pursuing a petty quarrel that had no bearing on the larger interests of his kingdom. His final act of forgiveness toward his killer, a gesture that contemporaries saw as evidence of his nobility, could not disguise the fact that his death accomplished nothing and solved nothing. The succession of John to the English throne marked the beginning of the most controversial reign in medieval English history. The youngest son of Henry II had spent his entire life in the shadow of his more glamorous brothers, earning the nickname Lochland because his father had struggled to find suitable territories for him to govern. His reputation for treachery, established during his brother's absence on crusade, preceded him to the throne and would colour every action he took as king. John's early years as king were dominated by the struggle to maintain control over the Angevin Empire against the increasingly aggressive attacks of Philip Augustus. The loss of Normandy in 1204, that catastrophic defeat that cost the English crown its ancestral homeland, was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological blow that shattered the confidence of the Anglo-Roman nobility and forced them to choose between their English and their continental identities. The baronses, who had held lands on both sides of the Channel for generations, found themselves compelled to abandon one set of estates or the other, creating resentments that would poison John's relationship with his nobility for the remainder of his reign. The financial crisis that resulted from the loss of Normandy's revenues forced John to explore new methods of taxation that brought him into conflict with every segment of English society. The forest laws that he enforced with unprecedented severity, the feudal obligations that he interpreted in the most restrictive possible terms, the judicial procedures that he manipulated to extract revenue rather than dispense justice, all demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate balance between royal authority and subject consent that his predecessors had maintained. The dispute between John and Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury escalated into a conflict that would transform the relationship between church and state throughout Europe. The interdict that the Pope placed on England, forbidding the celebration of Mass and the administration of sacraments, created a spiritual crisis that affected every level of society. The excommunication of John himself, declared in 1209, provided his enemies with a powerful weapon that they would use to justify rebellion and resistance. The perennial opposition that emerged during the later years of John's reign was unlike any previous challenge to royal authority, led by men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace Divesey. This movement combined practical grievances about taxation and legal procedure with theoretical arguments about the limits of royal power that drew upon both English custom and continental legal theory. The baronses who confronted John at Runny in 1215 were not merely defending their own privileges, but articulating principles of government that would influence political development for centuries to come. The Great Charter that John was forced to seal on June 15, 1215, represented a revolutionary moment in the history of medieval government. The 63 clauses of this document, hammered out through weeks of negotiation between the king and his barons, established principles that would eventually evolve into the constitutional foundations of English liberty. The famous clause that declared that no free man could be imprisoned or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, created a legal framework that would eventually extend protection to all subjects of the crown. But the immediate impact of Magna Carta was to plunge England into civil war. John's repudiation of the Charter within months of sealing it, supported by Pope Innocent III, who declared it invalid because it had been extracted by force, demonstrated that even the most solemn agreements could not resolve the fundamental tensions between royal authority and baronial resistance. The barons' invitation to Louis of France to invade England and claim the throne showed how completely the political consensus that had sustained the Angeva Empire had broken down. The civil war that consumed the final years of John's reign was fought with a bitterness that reflected the collapse of the feudal bonds that had once united king and nobles in common cause. The siege of Rochester Castle, where the barons' forces held out for weeks against royal artillery, became a symbol of the determination with which both sides pursued their conflicting visions of English government. The devastation that this conflict brought to the English countryside, the foreign mercenaries who ravaged the land in the service of competing claimants, the breakdown of law and order that made travel dangerous and commerce impossible, all demonstrated the terrible cost of political failure. John's death at Newark in October 1216, allegedly from dysentery, but possibly from poison, came at the moment when his cause seemed most hopeless. The king who had begun his reign as the undisputed master of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, died controlling little more than the western counties of England. His 9-year-old son, Henry, who inherited this desperate situation, seemed unlikely to succeed where his father had failed so completely. Yet the regency government that was established for the young Henry III, led by the papal legate Guala and the veteran administrator William Marshall, demonstrated remarkable skill in rebuilding royal authority from the ruins of John's reign. The reissue of Magna Carta in modified form, the negotiation of peace with the French invaders, the gradual reconciliation with the baronial opposition, all showed that the institutional foundations of English government were stronger than the personal failures of individual kings might suggest. The Battle of Lincoln in 1217, where the octogenarian William Marshall led the royal forces to victory against the baronial rebels and their French allies, marked the beginning of England's recovery from the crisis that had nearly destroyed the monarchy. The elderly knight who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty demonstrated that the ideals of chivalric service could still inspire extraordinary achievements. His victory achieved through a combination of tactical skill and moral Authorities saved the Plantagenet dynasty and preserved the political innovations that would eventually transform medieval England. The minority of Henry III, which lasted until 1227, provided the breathing space necessary for English institutions to recover from the trauma of John's reign. The slow process of rebuilding royal authority, the careful restoration of diplomatic relations with continental powers, the gradual healing of the wounds that civil war had inflicted on English society, all demonstrated the resilience of the political system that the Normans had created and that the Yanja had refined. As Henry III approached his majority and prepared to assume personal control of the government, the England he inherited was profoundly different from the kingdom that his great-grandfather Henry II had ruled. The loss of the continental territories had forced the English nobility to identify more closely with their island home, while the financial pressures of constant warfare had created new forms of political consultation that would eventually evolve into parliamentary government. The legal innovations of the Angevin period had created a system of common law that transcended local custom, while the administrative machinery of the crown had proven capable of functioning, even in the absence of effective royal leadership. The stage was set for the next great chapter in English constitutional development, as a new generation of kings and nobles would grapple with questions about the nature of royal authority, the rights of subjects, and the proper relationship between crown and community that would shape the future of English civilization. The story of how these questions were answered and of the dramatic events that would follow awaits us as we continue our journey through the mists of medieval time. The young king who came of age in 1227 inherited a realm transformed by crisis into something his predecessors could never have imagined. Henry III's England was no longer the continental empire that had once stretched from the Cheviot Hills to the Pyrenees, but an island kingdom forced to discover its own identity within the confines of the sea. This transformation would prove to be not a diminishment, but a concentration focusing English energies inward toward innovations in government, law, and culture that would eventually reshape the medieval world. The personal rule of Henry III began with promise, but quickly revealed the contradictions that would define his long and troubled reign. The king possessed genuine piety, refined artistic taste, and sincere devotion to his subjects' welfare. Yet, he lacked the practical political skills that effective medieval kingship required. His love of magnificence led him to embark on architectural projects that rivaled those of the greatest continental monarchs, while his generosity to foreign relatives and favorites created resentments that would poison his relationship with the English nobility for decades. The rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, Henry's greatest architectural achievement, exemplified both his vision and his limitations. The soaring Gothic arches, the intricate stone tracery, the jewel-like stained glass windows that transformed the ancient Saxon church into a monument worthy of European admiration, all demonstrated the cultural sophistication that English civilization had achieved. Yet, the enormous cost of this project, funded through taxation that pressed heavily upon an already burdened population, revealed the king's inability to balance aesthetic ambition with political reality. The provisions of Oxford imposed upon Henry by his baronses in 1258 represented a revolutionary attempt to limit royal authority through institutional reform rather than personal constraint. The Council of 15 nobles who were empowered to oversee royal policy, the requirement that the king consult with his subjects before making major decisions, the establishment of regular meetings to review governmental actions, all created a framework for constitutional monarchy that was centuries ahead of its time. Yet the provisions also revealed the fundamental tension between effective government and popular control that would haunt English politics for generations. The civil war that erupted when Henry attempted to overthrow the provisions brought to prominence one of the most remarkable figures in medieval English history. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, was a French nobleman who had married into the royal family and gradually transformed himself into a champion of English constitutional rights. His evolution from royal favorite to revolutionary leader reflected the broader changes that were transforming English society as men who had once defined themselves primarily through personal loyalty to the crown began to articulate concepts of national identity and popular sovereignty. The Battle of Lewes in 1264, where forces defeated the royal army and captured both Henry III and his son Edward, marked the temporary triumph of constitutional principles over royal absolutism. The parliament that de Montfort summoned in 1265, which included not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from the towns and shires, established precedents that would eventually evolve into the House of Commons. For the first time in English history, the voice of the common people was heard in the councils of government, creating a political revolution whose consequences would extend far beyond the medieval period. Yet de Montfort's triumph was brief and ultimately tragic. The Earl, who had fought to limit royal power, found himself wielding authority that was hardly less absolute than that of the kings he had opposed. His reliance on foreign mercenaries, his manipulation of popular assemblies, his increasing isolation from moderate opinion, all demonstrated the difficulty of translating constitutional theory into practical governance. His death at the Battle of Esham in 1265, where he was overwhelmed by the forces of Prince Edward, marked the end of the first great experiment in parliamentary government. The restoration of royal authority after Esham was accomplished with a moderation that reflected the lessons learned from decades of civil conflict. The dictum of Kenilworth, which established the terms for the reconciliation of the rebels, demonstrated that both sides had come to understand the futility of pursuing absolute victory. The king, who had been humiliated by his subjects' rebellion, showed mercy to his former enemies, while the baronses who had challenged royal authority accepted the restoration of traditional monarchy in exchange for guarantees of their customary rights. The reign of Edward II, who succeeded his father in 1272, marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history. The young king, who had learnt the arts of war in the bonial conflicts of his youth, brought to the throne a combination of military skill, administrative competence, and political vision that would transform England into one of Europe's most formidable powers. His conquest of Wales, his intervention in Scotland, his legal reforms, and his development of parliamentary institutions would establish patterns of English governance that would endure for centuries. The Welsh wars that occupied much of Edward's attention during the first decades of his reign were more than military campaigns. They were exercises in cultural transformation that would reshape the Celtic periphery of the British Isles, the great castles that Edward built to secure his conquests from Carafan to Connacht were not merely fortifications, but symbols of English power designed to overawe the Welsh people and demonstrate the permanence of their subjugation. The administrative system that he imposed upon Wales with its English laws and English officials gradually eroded the traditional Celtic customs that had governed Welsh society for centuries. The Scottish wars that dominated the later years of Edward's reign proved far more challenging than the Welsh campaigns had been. The death of Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent succession crisis that brought Scotland under English suzerainty seemed to promise an easy extension of Edward's authority northward. But the Scottish nobility's resistance to English rule, symbolized by the rebellion of William Wallace and later Robert Bruce, demonstrated that conquest and governance were very different achievements. The battles of Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn would become symbols of Scottish independence and reminders of the limits of English power. The legal innovations of Edward's reign, embodied in the great statutes that bear his name, represented a systematic attempt to codify and rationalize the common law that had evolved during the previous 2 centuries. The Statute of Westminster, the Statute of Mortmain, the Statute of Queer Emptor, all addressed specific problems in legal procedure and property law, but their cumulative effect was to create a coherent system of jurisprudence that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The king, who was known as the English Justinian, left behind a legal legacy that would prove more enduring than his military conquests. The development of parliamentary institutions during Edward's reign reflected the practical necessities of governing a complex society rather than any theoretical commitment to popular government. The assemblies that the king summoned to approve taxation, to hear petitions, to witness important ceremonies, gradually evolved into a regular part of the governmental process. The model Parliament of 1295, with its careful balance of nobles, clergy, and commons, established a template for representative government that would be copied throughout Europe. The financial pressures that drove Edward to seek parliamentary approval for his policies revealed the fundamental changes that were transforming medieval society. The king, who had inherited a realm where royal authority was largely self-financing, found himself governing a nation where the costs of administration, warfare, and diplomacy far exceeded traditional revenues. The taxes that Parliament granted, the loans that Italian bankers provided, the commercial duties that merchants paid, all demonstrated that England was becoming integrated into a European economy that operated according to new rules and new expectations. The expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 marked the end of an era in English economic development, while simultaneously revealing the religious and racial tensions that were reshaping European society. The Jewish communities that had provided essential financial services since the Norman conquest found themselves victims of popular prejudice and royal greed. Their departure forced English merchants and landowners to develop new forms of credit and investment, contributing to the commercial revolution that would eventually make England one of Europe's wealthiest nations. The cultural achievements of Edward's reign reflected the growing sophistication of English society. and its increasing integration with continental European civilization. The Gothic cathedrals that rose in cities throughout the kingdom, the illuminated manuscripts that were produced in monastic scriptoriums, the vernacular literature that was beginning to compete with Latin as a vehicle for serious expression, all demonstrated that England had become a major centre of medieval culture. The legal treatises of Beaton, the historical chronicles of Matthew Paris, the architectural innovations of the master masons who built Westminster Abbey, all contributed to a cultural flowering that rivaled anything achieved in France or Germany. The death of Edward the Firm in 1307 marked the end of an age of expansion and the beginning of a period of retrenchment that would test whether the institutions he had created could survive the transition to a new generation of leaders. The son who inherited his throne, Edward II, possessed none of his father's military skill or political acumen. Yet he would face challenges that would have tested even the most capable ruler. The Scottish wars that had seemed nearly won would drag on for decades. The financial problems that parliamentary taxation had temporarily solved would return with increased severity. And the constitutional questions that had been temporarily settled would re-emerge with new urgency. The reign of Edward II would demonstrate both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental system that had evolved during the previous century. The institutional framework that had been created to support strong kingship would prove inadequate when confronted with weak leadership, while the parliamentary traditions that had developed to limit royal authority would be tested by the need for effective government in times of crisis. The tragedy that would unfold during the early 14th century would reveal the fragility of medieval political arrangements and the terrible cost of constitutional failure. The story of that tragedy and of the remarkable recovery that would follow represents the next great chapter in the epic tale of medieval England as we continue our journey through the mists of time toward the dawn of a new age in English history. The foundations had been laid, the institutions established, the precedents set, but the greatest tests of English civilization still lay ahead, waiting to be met by future generations who would inherit both the achievements and the problems of their medieval ancestors. The young king who ascended the throne in 1307 seemed destined to undo everything his formidable father had achieved. Edward II possessed neither the iron will that had conquered Wales nor the political instincts that had transformed parliamentary assemblies into instruments of royal policy. Where his father had been a warrior king who led from the front, Edward II was a man of refined tastes and intimate friendships that scandalized a nobility, accustomed to the martial virtues of their class. The relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveristan, the Gascon knight who had been his companion since childhood, became the defining issue of the early years of the reign. The extraordinary honors that the king showered upon his favorite, the influence that Gaveston wielded over royal policy, the contempt that both men showed for the established nobility, all created a crisis that went far beyond personal jealousy or moral disapproval. The baronses who had learned to work within the constitutional framework established by Edward II found themselves confronting a king who seemed determined to govern through personal whim rather than institutional precedent. The ordinances of 1311, imposed upon Edward by his barons as much as the provisions of Oxford had been forced upon his grandfather represented another attempt to limit royal authority through constitutional means. The commission of 21 lords who were empowered to reform the royal household, the requirement that the king seek baronial approval for major appointments, the explicit demand that Gaveston be exiled from the realm, all demonstrated that the English nobility had learned to articulate their grievances in legal and institutional terms, rather than simply resorting to armed rebellion. Yet the tragedy of Edward II's reign lay not in his defiance of baronial demands, but in his inability to provide the leadership that the kingdom desperately needed. The Scottish wars that had seemed nearly won under his father's direction collapsed into a series of humiliating defeats that restored Scottish independence and shattered English military prestige. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert Bruce's forces destroyed the largest English army ever assembled, marked not just a military disaster, but a psychological trauma that would haunt English consciousness for generations. The financial crisis that resulted from these military failures forced Edward to summon Parliament with unprecedented frequency, creating opportunities for the Commons to assert their authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under his predecessors. The representatives of shires and boroughs who had once merely approved royal requests for taxation began to present petitions, to demand redress of grievances, to insist that their consent was necessary for any significant governmental action. The constitutional revolution that had begun under Henry III and been channeled under Edward the Fern now accelerated beyond any single individual's ability to control. The rise of Thomas of Lancaster as the effective ruler of England during the middle years of Edward's reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Bonial government. The king's cousin, who controlled vast territories in the north and commanded the loyalty of a significant portion of the nobility, possessed the resources and the authority to challenge royal power directly. Yet Lancaster's rule proved as arbitrary and ineffective as Edward's had been, revealing that the problems of medieval government extended far beyond the character of individual rulers. The murder of Piers Gaveston in 1312, carried out by a group of who had grown tired of constitutional restraints, marked a turning point in English political culture. The brutal execution of the king's favourite, seized while under safe conduct and killed without trial, demonstrated that the rule of law was still fragile and that personal hatred could override institutional procedures. The trauma that this event inflicted upon Edward II transformed him from a weak but essentially harmless ruler into a man consumed by the desire for revenge. The civil war that erupted when Edward finally moved against Lancaster and his allies revealed how completely the consensus that had once united the English nobility had broken down. The Battle of Burbridge in 1322, where Lancaster's forces were defeated and the Earl himself captured and executed, marked the temporary triumph of royal authority. But the king's victory was achieved through methods that violated every principle of justice and due process that English law had established, creating precedents that would eventually destroy the monarchy itself. The rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger as Edward's new favourite demonstrated that the king had learned nothing from the Gaveston affair. The rapacious greed with which the Despensers accumulated lands and offices, the contempt they showed for established legal procedures, the violence they employed against their enemies, all recreated the conditions that had led to the earlier crisis. The difference was that Hugh Despenser was far more dangerous than Gaveston had ever been, possessing both the administrative skills and the ruthless ambition necessary to transform favoritism into systematic tyranny. The invasion of England by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326 represented more than a rebellion against an unpopular king. It was a revolutionary moment that would reshape the relationship between crown and subject for centuries to come. The queen, who had been humiliated by her husband's open preference for male favorites. The exiled baron who had escaped from the Tower of London to seek refuge in France. Together they assembled a coalition that included not just disaffected nobles, but representatives of the merchant classes and the common people who had grown weary of incompetent government. The speed with which Edward II's regime collapsed revealed how completely it had lost the support of the English people. The king who had once commanded the resources of the wealthiest kingdom in Europe found himself abandoned by his own servants, pursued by his own subjects, reduced to a fugitive in his own realm. The capture of Edward and the Despensers at Neath Abbey in November 1326 marked the end of one of the most disastrous reigns in English history. But it also raised questions about the nature of royal authority that would haunt English politics for generations. The deposition of Edward II in 1327 required constitutional innovations that had no precedent in English law. The parliament that was summoned to witness the king's abdication included not just the traditional estates of nobles and clergy, but representatives from every level of society, creating an assembly that could claim to speak for the entire English people. The articles of accusation that were read against the king, the formal renunciation of allegiance that followed, the recognition of his infant son as the new monarch, all established procedures that would be remembered when future generations faced similar crises. The murder of Edward IV at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, carried out on the orders of Roger Mortimer with the probable connivance of Queen Isabella, demonstrated that even the most elaborate constitutional procedures could not entirely eliminate the role of violence in medieval politics. The manner of the king's death, allegedly killed by a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels, was designed to leave no external marks while inflicting maximum agony. The symbolism was unmistakable. The king, who had violated the natural order through his unnatural relationships, had suffered a punishment that reflected the horror of his crimes. The regency of Isabella and Mortimer, which governed England in the name of the young Edward III, quickly revealed that the removal of a tyrannical king did not automatically produce good government. The Queen Mother and her lover proved as rapacious and arbitrary as the Despensers had been, accumulating wealth and power while neglecting the administrative reforms that the kingdom desperately needed. Their rule demonstrated that the problems of medieval government ran deeper than the personal failings of individual rulers, reflecting fundamental tensions between the demands of effective administration and the constraints of constitutional law. The coup by which Edward III seized control of the government in 1330, capturing Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and sending him to the scaffold, marked the beginning of the most glorious period in medieval English history. The young king who had been raised amid the political chaos of his father's reign and the moral corruption of his mother's regency possessed both the military genius and the political wisdom necessary to restore English power and prestige. His reign would witness the beginning of the 100 Years' War, the flowering of English culture, and the development of parliamentary institutions that would eventually transform the nature of European government. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, where Edward III's forces crushed a Scottish army and restored English dominance over the northern kingdom, demonstrated that the military disasters of his father's reign had been the result of incompetent leadership rather than any fundamental weakness in English military organization. The innovative tactics that Edward employed, combining dismounted men-at-arms with archers in a formation that maximized the effectiveness of the long bow, would revolutionize European warfare and establish England as the dominant military power of the 14th century. The claim to the French throne that Edward III advanced in 1337 based on his descent from Philip IV through his mother Isabella provided the pretext for a conflict that would define English foreign policy for more than a century. The war that followed was not merely a dynastic dispute, but a struggle for control of the economic and political systems that governed Western Europe. The English wool trade, the Flemish textile industry, the French wine regions, all became battlegrounds in a conflict that would reshape the medieval world. The great victory at Chi in 1346, where Edward III's army destroyed the flower of French chivalry through the devastating effectiveness of mass archery, marked the beginning of English military supremacy that would endure for generations. The death of the blind King John of Bohemia, who rode into battle tied to his horse so that he could strike one blow for honor before he died, symbolized the passing of an age when individual heroism could triumph over technological innovation and tactical sophistication. The siege of Killala that followed Cray demonstrated Edward III's understanding that lasting victory required not just military success, but strategic control of key positions. The year-long investment of the great port city, the systematic starvation of its population, the dramatic surrender of the burghers who offered their lives to save their fellow citizens, all created a legend that would inspire English patriotism for centuries. The establishment of an English garrison at Killala provided a permanent foothold on the continent that would serve as a base for future campaigns and a symbol of English power. The Black Death that struck England in 1348 represented a catastrophe that dwarfed any military defeat or political crisis the kingdom had yet experienced. The plague that had originated in Central Asia and spread along the trade routes of the medieval world killed perhaps a third of England's population, transforming every aspect of society in ways that would take centuries to understand fully. The social and economic disruption that followed would challenge every assumption about the proper ordering of medieval society and force. Innovations in government, law, and culture that would accelerate the transformation of England into a modern state. The labor shortage that resulted from the plague's devastation gave the surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power, leading to wage increases and social mobility that threatened the entire structure of feudal society. The Statute of Labourers passed by Parliament in 1351 represented a desperate attempt to freeze wages and social relationships at pre-plague levels. But the economic forces that the plague had unleashed proved stronger than any legislation could contain, creating tensions that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The renewal of the French War in the 1350s provided Edward III with opportunities to demonstrate that English military superiority had survived the plague's devastation. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the Black Prince's forces captured King John II of France and decimated the French nobility, confirmed that the tactical innovations pioneered at Creil could be repeated with devastating effect. The ransom demanded for the French king's release provided England with resources that funded further military campaigns and magnificent cultural projects that proclaimed English power to the world. The Treaty of Brittany in 1360, which granted England's sovereignty over Aquitaine and Killala in exchange for Edward III's renunciation of his claim to the French throne, seemed to mark the triumph of English arms and diplomacy. Yet the peace that followed proved more challenging than the war that had preceded it. The soldiers who had grown wealthy through plunder and ransom found themselves without employment, while the administrative challenges of governing vast territories in France tested the capabilities of English government in ways that purely military campaigns never had. The Good Parliament of 1376, which met in the final years of Edward III's reign, demonstrated how completely the political balance had shifted since the beginning of the century. The Commons, emboldened by their role in financing the French wars, began to assert their authority in ways that would have been unthinkable under earlier kings. The impeachment of corrupt officials, the demand for regular accounting of royal expenditures, the insistence that taxation required genuine parliamentary consent, all established precedents that would eventually transform the nature of English government. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 and of Edward III himself in 1377 marked the end of an age of military glory and the beginning of a period of internal conflict that would test whether the institutions created during the previous century could survive the transition to a new generation of leaders. The child who inherited the throne as Richard II would face challenges that would have tested even the most experienced ruler, while the baronses who surrounded him would discover that the lessons of the past provided imperfect guidance for the problems of the future. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which erupted during the early years of Richard II's reign, represented the culmination of social tensions that had been building since the Black Death. The poll tax that triggered the uprising was merely the final straw that broke the patience of a peasantry that had endured decades of oppression and exploitation. The rebels who marched on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler and John B. articulated demands that went far beyond tax relief, calling for the abolition of serfdom, the redistribution of wealth, and the establishment of a more egalitarian society. The dramatic confrontation at Smithfield, where the young Richard II faced the rebel leaders in person, demonstrated both the courage and the cunning that would characterize his reign. The king's promise to grant the rebels' demands, his apparent sympathy for their grievances, his willingness to risk his own safety to prevent further violence, all created a legend that would inspire future generations of English monarchs. Yet the brutal suppression of the revolt that followed, the execution of its leaders, the restoration of the old order, all revealed that even the most dramatic gestures of royal sympathy could not overcome the fundamental inequalities of medieval society. The story of how Richard II's reign evolved from this promising beginning to its tragic conclusion represents the next great chapter in the epic tale of medieval England. As we continue our journey through the mists of time toward the dawn of a new age in English history, the institutions had been tested, the precedents established, the foundations laid, but the greatest challenges to English civilization still lay ahead, waiting to be met by future generations who would inherit both the achievements and the problems of their medieval ancestors. The young king who inherited the throne in 1377 seemed destined to complete the constitutional revolution that had been building for over a century. Richard II possessed the intelligence, the education, and the royal charisma that his immediate predecessors had lacked. Yet he would face challenges that would test not just his personal character, but the very foundations of English government. The kingdom he inherited was no longer the feudal realm of his great-grandfather, Edward II, but a complex society where new forms of wealth, new ideas about governance, and new expectations of royal authority were reshaping the ancient relationships between crown and subject. The cultural flowering that characterized Richard's court reflected the growing sophistication of English society and its increasing confidence in its own distinctive identity. The poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, with its vivid portraits of English life from the knight to the ploughman, demonstrated that the English language had evolved into a vehicle capable of expressing the full range of human experience. The elaborate ceremonial that surrounded the king, the magnificent tournaments that celebrated chivalric ideals, the architectural innovations that transformed royal residences into palaces worthy of European admiration, all proclaimed that England had become a major center of medieval civilization. Yet beneath this glittering surface, tensions were building that would eventually destroy both the king and the constitutional system he had inherited. The financial pressures created by constant warfare, the social disruption caused by the plague, the religious controversies sparked by reformers like John Wycliffe, all challenged the traditional assumptions that had governed English society for centuries. The Parliament that had evolved as a partner in royal government began to assert its authority in ways that threatened the very concept of monarchical supremacy. The Lords Appellant crisis of 1387 to 1388 revealed how completely the political balance had shifted since the days of Edward III. The coalition of great magnates who challenged Richard's authority did not seek to overthrow the monarchy but to control it using parliamentary procedures and legal precedents to limit royal power in ways that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. The merciless parliament that followed demonstrated that the constitutional weapons forged during previous crises could be turned against the crown itself, creating a new form of political conflict that transcended the personal rivalries of medieval politics. Richard's response to this humiliation revealed both his political genius and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that were reshaping English society. The king, who had been forced to watch his friends executed and his policies overturned, spent the next decade carefully rebuilding his authority, using legal precedents and parliamentary procedures to strengthen royal power, while maintaining the appearance of constitutional government. His creation of a court party loyal to his person rather than to institutional traditions. His manipulation of legal procedures to eliminate his enemies. His gradual accumulation of unprecedented royal authority. All demonstrated that the constitutional limitations imposed by Parliament could be circumvented by a ruler skilled in the arts of political manipulation. The tyranny that Richard established during the final years of his reign was more dangerous than the crude despotism of earlier monarchs precisely, because it operated within the forms of constitutional government while violating its spirit. The court of chivalry that he used to bypass common law procedures, the blank charters that he forced his subjects to sign, the forced loans that he extracted without parliamentary consent, all created a system of royal absolutism that was more sophisticated and more oppressive than anything England had previously experienced. The revolution of 1399 that brought Henry of Bolingbroke to the throne as Henry IV represented more than a simple change of dynasty. It was a constitutional crisis that would reshape the relationship between Crown and Parliament for centuries to come. The Duke of Lancaster's claim to the throne, based on a combination of hereditary recognition, established precedents that would eventually transform the nature of English kingship. The deposition of Richard II, carried out through parliamentary procedures that gave legal sanction to what was essentially a military coup, demonstrated that even the most sacred aspects of royal authority was subject to popular consent. The reign of Henry IV proved that winning a throne was easier than keeping it, especially when the legitimacy of that throne remained questionable. The new king faced not just the practical challenges of governing a kingdom exhausted by decades of warfare and internal conflict, but the theoretical problem of justifying his authority to subjects who had sworn allegiance to his predecessor. The rebellions that erupted throughout his reign, from the Welsh uprising of Owen Glendower to the northern revolts of the Percy family, all drew their strength from the fundamental illegitimacy of Lancastrian rule. The financial crisis that plagued Henry IV's government revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted between Crown and Parliament. The king, who had seized the throne with promises of constitutional government, found himself more dependent on parliamentary grants than any of his predecessors had been. The Commons, emboldened by their role in legitimizing the new dynasty, began to assert their authority over royal policy in ways that would have been unthinkable under the Plantagenets. The principle that taxation required parliamentary consent, which had been established during earlier crises, evolved into the broader concept that Parliament must approve all major governmental actions. The accession of Henry V in 1413 marked the beginning of the most glorious period in medieval English history, as the young king who had spent his youth learning the arts of war and government proved capable of achievements that rivaled those of Edward III. The renewal of the French War, justified by claims that had been dormant for decades, provided Henry with the opportunity to unite his divided kingdom behind a common cause, while demonstrating that English military superiority had survived the constitutional upheavals of the previous generation. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 where Henry's outnumbered forces destroyed a French army that seemed invincible, became the defining moment of English medieval culture. The victory that was achieved through a combination of tactical innovation, disciplined courage, and divine favor created a legend that would inspire English patriots for centuries. The longbowmen who stood their ground against charging knights, the dismounted men-at-arms who fought with desperate valor, the king himself who shared the dangers of his humblest soldier, all became symbols of English greatness that transcended the immediate military consequences of the battle. The conquest of Normandy that followed Agincourt demonstrated that Henry V possessed not just the military genius necessary to win battles, but the administrative skills required to govern conquered territories, the systematic reduction of Norman strongholds, the establishment of English garrisons throughout the Duchy, the creation of an administrative system that could extract resources while maintaining local loyalty, all showed that the English had learned the lessons of their earlier continental adventures. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne, seemed to promise the realization of English ambitions that had been frustrated for generations. Yet, the very completeness of Henry VI's triumph contained the seeds of future disaster. The king who had united England behind his French ambitions died at the moment when his achievements seemed most secure, leaving an infant son to inherit territories that could only be maintained through constant warfare. The Regency government that was established for Henry VI faced the impossible task of governing two kingdoms whose interests were fundamentally incompatible, while managing a nobility that had grown accustomed to the profits of conquest and would not icily accept the limitations of peace. The gradual loss of the French territories during the minority of Henry V revealed how completely English success had depended on the personal authority of individual kings. The Battle of Bedtime in 1429, which inspired leadership, transformed French military capabilities, marked the beginning of a French recovery that would eventually drive the English from all their continental possessions except Calais. The Siege of Olon, the coronation of the Dauphin at Rheims, the systematic reconquest of English strongholds, all demonstrated that the French had learned to combine religious enthusiasm with military innovation in ways that English commanders could not match. The return of English armies from France brought home not just defeated soldiers, but new ideas about government, society, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. The veterans who had grown wealthy through plunder and ransom found themselves without employment in a kingdom that offered few opportunities for advancement. The nobles who had commanded armies in France discovered that their military experience counted for little in the complex world of English politics. Most dangerously, the common soldiers who had seen their social superiors flee from battle began to question the assumptions about hierarchy and authority that had governed English society for centuries. The mental illness that afflicted Henry V beginning in the 1450s created a crisis of authority that would ultimately destroy the Lancastrian dynasty. The king, who had been raised to believe in the divine nature of his office, found himself unable to exercise the most basic functions of government, while the regents who governed in his name lacked the legitimacy necessary to maintain order. the factional conflicts that erupted as various nobles competed for control of the helpless king gradually escalated into the civil war that would be remembered as the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of St. Albans in 1455, where the Duke of York's forces defeated the royal army and captured Henry V, himself, marked the beginning of 30 years of intermittent warfare that would transform English society more profoundly than any foreign invasion. The conflict that followed was not merely a dynastic dispute, but a struggle between competing visions of English government as the Yorkist and Lancastrian parties articulated different theories about the nature of royal authority and the rights of subjects. The deposition of Henry V in 1461 and the coronation of Edward IV as king demonstrated that the precedents established during the Revolution of 1399 could be repeated whenever circumstances demanded. The young Yorkist king, who claimed the throne through a combination of military victory and hereditary right, represented a new generation of English rulers who understood that successful monarchy required not just traditional legitimacy but popular support. The administrative reforms that Edward IV implemented, the commercial policies that he pursued, the cultural patronage that he provided, all showed that the English monarchy was adapting to the changing realities of late medieval society. The restoration of Henry V in 1470 and his second deposition in 1471 revealed how completely the old certainties about royal authority had been shattered. The battles of Barnard and Tewkesbury, where Edward IV's forces finally destroyed Lancastrian resistance, marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of the medieval period in English history. The death of the last Lancastrian prince at Tewkesbury, the murder of Henry V in the Tower of London, the systematic elimination of all potential claimants to the throne, all demonstrated that the Wars of the Roses had been fought with a ruthlessness that exceeded anything seen in previous English conflicts. The reign of Edward IV, restored to his throne in 1471, marked the beginning of a new age in English history. The king, who had learned statecraft through civil war, understood that lasting peace required not just military victory, but the reconstruction of the governmental institutions that conflict had damaged. The expansion of royal authority, the development of more efficient administrative procedures, the establishment of new sources of royal revenue, all showed that the English monarchy was evolving into something more modern and more powerful than its medieval predecessors. The brief reign of Edward V in 1483 and his mysterious disappearance in the Tower of London created the final crisis of the medieval period. The usurpation of Richard III, justified through claims about the illegitimacy of his predecessor's children, demonstrated that the constitutional principles established during previous centuries could still be manipulated by ruthless individuals who understood the weaknesses of the system. The rebellion that erupted against Richard's rule, the invasion of Henry Tudor, the Battle of Bosworth Field, where the last Plantagenet king died fighting for his crown, all marked the end of the medieval age and the beginning of the Tudor period. As we reach the end of our journey through the mists of medieval time, we can see how the threads of this great tapestry have been woven together across nearly 1,000 years of English history. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, that emerged from the ruins of Roman Britain, the Norman conquest that transformed English society, the Anan Empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the constitutional developments that limited royal power, the cultural flowering that produced Chaucer and the great cathedrals, the military triumphs that made England a European power, the civil wars that tested every institution, all contributed to the creation of a civilization that would eventually spread across the globe. The England that Henry VIII inherited in 1485 was no longer the feudal kingdom of William the Conqueror or the personal domain of Henry II, but a nation-state with sophisticated governmental institutions, a distinctive cultural identity, and a sense of historical destiny that would drive future expansion and achievement. The parliament that had evolved from medieval assemblies would eventually become the mother of democratic institutions worldwide. The common law that had emerged from Anglo-Saxon custom and Norman efficiency would spread throughout the English-speaking world. The language that had absorbed influences from Latin, French, and Germanic sources would become the vehicle for a literature that would be read and admired wherever human beings sought to understand the complexities of existence. The story of medieval England is ultimately the story of how a collection of warring tribes became a unified nation, how feudal relationships evolved into constitutional government, how local customs developed into universal principles of law and justice. It is a tale of remarkable individuals who shaped the course of history through their courage, their wisdom, and their determination to create something better than what they had inherited. But it is also the story of ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen, merchants and soldiers who built the foundations of modern civilization through their daily labor and their willingness to defend the institutions that protected their rights and freedoms. As sleep carries you away from these ancient shores, remember that the medieval world was not a distant realm of knights and castles existing in romantic isolation, but the foundation upon which our modern world was built. The freedoms we enjoy, the laws that protect us, the institutions that govern us, all trace their origins back to those misty centuries when England was young and the future was being written in the deeds of men and women, whose names still echo through the halls of history. In their struggles and triumphs, their failures and achievements, we can see reflected our own eternal human quest to create order from chaos, justice from oppression, and hope from despair. The medieval age had ended, but its legacy would endure forever, carried forward by succeeding generations, who would build upon the foundations that their ancestors had laid with such courage and determination. The mists of time may obscure the details of individual lives, but the great themes of human aspiration and achievement that defined medieval England continue to inspire and guide us as we face the challenges of our own age. In the end, that is perhaps the greatest gift that the medieval world has given us. The knowledge that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they are united by common purpose and sustained by unshakable faith in the possibility of human progress. So, even though the heavy armor and massive castles of medieval England are now museum pieces, the seeds of the parliamentary system and the rule of law were sown in those days. Completing this misty panorama, we explored the roots of the modern world together. Take care of yourselves until we meet again on the next journey of discovery.